The night Greta Holloway stepped between a frail old woman and a man's raised fist. She wasn't thinking about consequences. She wasn't thinking at all. That was always her problem, her mother used to say. You act before your brain catches up, baby girl. Maybe. But if Greta had stopped to think that night, she would have turned around and walked straight back to the kitchen. And everything, every single thing that came after, would have gone differently. She had been working the Delacorte estate for exactly 11 days when it happened. 11 days of waking before 5, taking 2 buses across the east side of the city, and slipping through the service entrance before the household stirred. 11 days of learning which floorboards groaned, which crystal glasses were hand-wash only, which members of the staff she could trust, and which ones liked to report back to the housekeeper, a tightly wound woman named Mrs. Pelham, who wore her silver hair in a bun, so severe it looked painful. Greta wasn't supposed to have this job. She'd applied for a receptionist position at a dental office on Barton Street. She'd worn her good blazer, printed her resume on cardstock, rehearsed answers to the usual questions on the bus ride over. The dental office never called back. But a woman named Sylvia at the placement agency had called 3 days later and said, I have something. Private household, north side, long days, good pay, cash, weekly. Interested? Greta had been $700 behind on rent, so yes, she was interested. Nobody at the agency told her whose household it was. She didn't find out until her 3rd day on the job, when one of the other women, a compact, fast-moving woman named Berta, who'd been there 4 years, leaned over while they were polishing silver in the basement and said it plain and quiet, like she was commenting on the weather. You know who this house belongs to. Greta had thought it was a question. A Mr. Delacorte. Christian Delacorte. The Delacorte. She'd let that sit. You don't know the name. I don't, Greta said. Should I? Berta went back to polishing. Just don't ask questions you don't need answered. Do your work. Stay out of the East Wing. And if he looks at you, don't look back. Greta had taken the advice seriously about the East Wing. The rest of it she'd filed away and mostly forgotten. She was busy enough staying on Mrs. Pelham's good side, which was roughly the width of a postage stamp, and memorizing the schedule of the household's 12 rooms. She'd seen Christian Delacorte twice in 11 days, both times from a distance. Once crossing the main hallway, dark suit, a phone pressed to his ear, not looking at anything except the middle distance in front of him. Once through a window, standing in the rear garden, with 2 men she didn't recognize, speaking too quietly to hear. He was tall, dark-haired, going grey at the temples, somewhere north of 40. He moved like a man who expected space to be made for him. It always was. The household, Greta had learned, ran on a precise and unspoken set of rules. Nobody discussed the nature of Mr. Delacorte's business. Nobody lingered in the hallways. Nobody knocked on the study door after 9 in the evening. And nobody went near the woman who lived in the room at the end of the 2nd floor corridor, the room with the window that looked out at the old oak tree, unless they had been specifically assigned to her. Her name was Miriam, Mr. Delacorte's mother. Greta had heard the name before she ever saw the woman. Heard it in the careful, lowered voices of the other staff, always with a kind of cautious tenderness, the way you'd speak about something breakable. On her 7th day, Greta had passed the open doorway of the 2nd floor room and seen Miriam for the first time. An old woman, small and bird-like in a wide armchair, wearing a cream-colored robe and looking at the window with an expression of absolute calm, the kind of calm that had nothing behind it. She was somewhere far away that had nothing to do with that room or that house or anyone in it. She'd turned when Greta passed. Their eyes met. "Robert," Miriam said, clear and certain, as though she were greeting someone she'd expected. Greta had stopped. "No, ma'am. I'm Greta. I work here." Miriam had studied her face with that clear, absent gaze. "Have you had breakfast?" "I have. Yes, thank you." "Good." Miriam had turned back to the window. "You should..." always eat breakfast. Robert never did, I told him. Greta had stood in the doorway a moment longer than she needed to. Then she'd gone back to the linen closet and finished her work. But she thought about the old woman for the rest of the day. She thought about the way Miriam's hands rested in her lap, perfectly still, and how she'd asked about breakfast like it was the most important thing in the world, and how nobody had seemed to be with her in that room except the view of the oak tree and the long, quiet morning. The event on the 11th day was not supposed to involve Greta at all. Christian Delacorte was hosting a private dinner. Not large, 14 guests, the formal dining room, the good china, a catered menu that had been discussed between Mrs. Pelham and the kitchen staff for days beforehand. Greta had been assigned to the upstairs hallway that evening. Small tasks, keeping the powder room stocked, making sure the guest coat room was tidy, staying out of the way. The guests arrived at 7. She heard them from upstairs, the low rumble of expensive cars, the sound of voices, a woman's laughter, sharp and bright as a wine glass struck with a spoon. Greta stayed where she was, folding towels she'd already folded twice. She heard the dinner begin. The drift of conversation, the distant clink of cutlery, a man's voice telling a story that drew a rounded, satisfied sound from the table. It was around 9:30 when she noticed Miriam's door was open. Greta set down the hand towel she was holding. She walked to the end of the corridor. The room was empty. The armchair was empty. The window was dark. She went down the back stairs. She didn't run, because running in the household meant something was wrong, and she didn't want to draw attention before she knew what she was dealing with. She moved fast and quiet, the way she'd gotten good at in those 11 days, and she started at the kitchen and worked her way through. The pantry, the rear sitting room, the library. She found Miriam in the hallway outside the dining room. The old woman was standing in the thin strip of shadow between two sets of wall sconces, wearing her cream-colored robe over bare feet, holding the wall with one hand and looking at the closed dining room doors with an expression of gentle confusion. She'd gotten herself turned around. She was trying to find something, the kitchen, her room, a person, a year. Greta couldn't tell, and the looking had brought her here. Miriam. Greta kept her voice low and even. "Hey, there you are." Miriam turned. "I was looking for the kitchen. I know, it's the other direction. I'll take you." Robert didn't eat breakfast. Miriam said again, the same matter-of-fact certainty. "I've been meaning to speak to him about it. We can talk about that. Let's get you somewhere warm first." Greta put a gentle hand on Miriam's elbow and began steering her back toward the kitchen end of the house. They were 8 feet from the dining room doors when one of them opened. The woman who stepped out was the kind of woman who knew exactly the effect she had walking into a room. Late 30s, maybe early 40s, dark hair ironed smooth, wearing a deep green dress that fit like it had been made specifically for her body. She had a glass of red wine in one hand and her phone in the other, and she stopped when she saw them, and the expression that moved across her face was not surprise. It was annoyance, efficient and cold, the way you'd look at a problem you'd already decided how to solve. "She's out again." The woman's voice was flat, addressed to nobody in particular. She slipped her phone into her clutch. Her eyes moved to Greta. "Who are you?" "I work here, ma'am. I was just bringing her back upstairs. She is supposed to be in her room." The woman stepped closer. "This is the 3rd time this week. Do you have any idea who's in there?" She tilted her head toward the dining room doors. "Associates, business. This is not. She cannot be wandering the hallway like a—" "She got turned around," Greta said. "It happens. We're heading back upstairs now." Something shifted in the woman's face. Greta had struck a tone she hadn't meant to. Not defiant exactly, just firm. And firm, apparently, was not something this woman was accustomed to from household staff. "I beg your pardon?" I said, "We're heading upstairs." "I've got her." Miriam had pressed closer to Greta's side, not out of fear. She didn't seem frightened. She seemed simply to have decided that Greta was the person to stay near. She was watching the woman in the green dress with that same calm, unanchored gaze. "Who's this?" Miriam asked Greta, quiet and curious. "A guest, ma'am. She's not very friendly." Greta kept her face still. Beside her, Miriam reached out and patted Greta's hand twice, with great confidence, as though Greta were the one who needed reassuring. The woman in the green dress had gone very quiet. Her chin had lifted. She was looking at Miriam now with an expression Greta recognized from places she'd worked before. From certain customers, certain managers, certain people who had decided, long before this moment, that some people didn't warrant basic care. "You don't belong in this hallway," the woman said to Miriam. Her voice had gone low and clipped, the way a voice goes when someone is angry, but still performing composure. Miriam looked at her with polite interest. "I was looking for the kitchen. You're embarrassing this family." Each word landed separate and deliberate. "You have one job, and that is to stay in your room and not." She reached out. Not a grab, a shove. A single contemptuous push toward Miriam's shoulder, the kind of gesture designed to make a small, frail, confused old woman stumble. Greta moved. She didn't decide to. Her body moved before she knew it was happening, and she stepped into the space between them, and the woman's hand struck Greta squarely across the upper arm and the side of her face, open-palmed and hard. It wasn't meant for Greta. It landed on Greta anyway. The hallway went absolutely still. The woman stared. Her hand was still half raised. She looked at Greta the way you look at something that has done something impossible, and you are still processing whether it happened. Greta's ear was ringing. She stood where she was. "Get out of my way," the woman said. "No," Greta said. Her voice was very calm, and she was surprised by that. "I won't." The woman's eyes had gone narrow and cold. "Do you have any idea, Greta?" The voice came from behind her, and even before she turned, she felt it, the way everyone in a room feels it when a certain person speaks. Not loudness, the opposite of loudness. A quiet that had absolute weight behind it. She turned. Christian Delacorte was standing in the open dining room door. He had come out silently, or he had been there longer than she realized. He was holding nothing. Both hands were loose at his sides. His face was composed, completely, and his dark eyes were moving across the scene in the hallway with the careful, unhurried attention of someone taking inventory. Several of his guests had followed him into the doorway. Nobody spoke. Christian's gaze moved from Greta to his mother. He looked at Miriam for a long moment. She was calm, still holding Greta's arm, looking back at her son with a placid expression that broke Greta's heart a little, the gap between what his face was doing and what Miriam's was. And then he looked at the woman in the green dress. The woman's name, Greta would learn later, was Ingrid Voss. She was the daughter of one of Christian Delacorte's business partners, and she had been, until approximately 4 minutes ago, considered a likely future fixture in the Delacorte household. She had been seated at Christian's right at dinner. She had been maneuvering toward that seat for the better part of 2 years. None of that was visible on Christian's face as he looked at her. What was visible on his face was nothing, and nothing was worse. "Ingrid," he said. She recovered fast. Greta had to give her that. She straightened and adjusted the strap of her dress, and her chin came up. "Christian, your mother was loose in the hallway again. I was handling. Were you?" It wasn't a question. The 2 words dropped into the hallway and the conversation ended. Ingrid looked around at the guests in the doorway and seemed to realize for the first time what the shape of the moment was. The weight of it. Who had seen what? She shoved her. Greta hadn't planned to say it. It came out in the same flat, steady voice, and she was already committed before she'd finished the first word. "She tried to push your mother. I stepped in. That is not." Ingrid started. "I saw it. This was a new voice. A compact man in a dark suit standing at the edge of the dining room doorway. Someone Greta didn't know. He said it without expression, just a statement of fact. The silence stretched. Christian Delacorte looked at Greta, really looked at her, not the quick, surveying glance she'd experienced from him at a distance, but direct and sustained, reading something in her face she couldn't identify. His expression hadn't changed. His eyes were very dark and completely still. "Take my mother upstairs," he said, quiet, addressed to Greta alone. "Please." The please was not nothing. She heard it. "Yes, sir," she said. She turned back to Miriam, who was watching her son with a soft, wondering expression, and gently guided her toward the back staircase. Behind her, she heard Christian say one more thing, still in that same low, weighted voice. "Ingrid, get your coat." She didn't hear the rest. She was already moving Miriam toward the stairs. One slow step at a time, the old woman's hand warm and small inside hers. Upstairs, she got Miriam settled, changed her slippers, found the blue throw blanket, the other staff kept folded on the cedar chest at the foot of the bed, and laid it over the old woman's lap. Miriam had been telling her about Robert the whole way upstairs. Not her son, Greta, had worked out by now, but some Robert from much further back, a brother or a friend or a man from a time the rest of the world no longer had access to. He came by on Sundays, Miriam said, every Sunday, never missed one, even when it snowed. "That's loyalty," Greta said. "That's love," Miriam corrected, gently, like Greta had almost gotten the right answer on a test. Greta tucked the blanket and turned off the overhead light and turned on the small bedside lamp, the one with the amber shade that made the room feel warmer. She stood at the window for a moment and looked out at the old oak tree, which was only a shape of darkness outside, and thought about the woman in the green dress and the sound the hallway had made when everything stopped. She was going to lose this job. That was her clear, practical thought. She had stepped in front of a guest. She had refused a direct instruction. She had made a scene, or been present for one, which amounted to the same thing, in front of business associates. Mrs. Pelham was going to find her in the morning, and the conversation would be very brief. And then Greta would be on the bus back across the east side. She'd worry about it tomorrow. Right now, Miriam was half asleep in the amber light, her hands folded in her lap, her chest rising and falling with a slow, unconcerned rhythm. And that was the whole of the world worth attending to at this particular moment. "Good night, Miriam," Greta said. "Good night, sweetheart," Miriam said, to someone who may or may not have been Greta. In the morning, Mrs. Pelham found her at 7 a.m. in the kitchen, and the conversation was, in fact, brief. "Mr. Delacorte wants to see you. Not your let go, not collect your things." Greta had braced for both. She followed Mrs. Pelham down the main hallway and waited while the housekeeper knocked on the study door and then opened it without waiting for a response. The single piece of evidence, Greta thought, that whatever Mrs. Pelham felt about this, she'd been told how to handle it. The study was a room built for serious things. Floor-to-ceiling shelves on 2 walls, the kind of furniture that had been chosen for permanence over comfort, 2 windows that looked out at the rear garden where the morning was grey and still. There was a desk the size of a small country, and behind it, Christian Delacorte was sitting with a coffee and a newspaper folded in quarters, and he looked up when she came in and set both down. She stood in front of the desk because there was nowhere else to stand. She didn't know where to put her hands. "Greta Holloway," he said. "Yes, sir." He looked at her for a moment. In the daylight, in this room, he looked like he hadn't slept, which was the first ordinary thing she had noticed about him. There were lines around his eyes. He was wearing a shirt that was slightly less perfect than anything she'd seen him in before, the top button undone. He looked like a man who had been awake for several hours dealing with something difficult. "You've been here 11 days, he said. "Yes. What did Berta tell you about my household?" Greta considered. "To do my work. Stay out of the East Wing. Don't ask unnecessary questions. And last night, I wasn't in the East Wing." Something moved in his face that took her a moment to read. She realized, with a faint shock, that it was almost amusement. It came and went very quickly. "No," he said. "You weren't." He picked up the coffee. My mother has lived with me for 3 years. She has good days and bad days and days where she is not entirely certain what year it is or who is standing in front of her. She is, in every version of every day, someone whose dignity matters to me. He said this with a plainness that was more striking than any emphasis would have been, like it was simply the primary fact around which everything else was organized. Greta waited. "What you did last night," he said. "I am aware of what it cost you in terms of position here, taking a blow meant for my mother, from a guest, in front of witnesses. It was not a small thing. She was going to fall," Greta said. "That's all I was thinking. She would have fallen. I know. I wasn't trying to cause a problem. I know that too." He set down the coffee. He had a way of doing everything with a kind of precise economy of motion, like nothing was done without intention. He folded his hands on the desk. "I'm asking you to stay on," he said, "in a different capacity. My mother has a nurse who comes 3 days a week. The rest of the time, the household manages, which is to say, not particularly well. I'd like someone with her more consistently. Not medical. That's what the nurse is for. Someone who checks on her, who knows her schedule, who takes her to the kitchen when she goes looking for it, instead of leaving her to find her own way." He paused. "She mentioned you twice this morning." Greta blinked. "She knows my name." "She called you the kind one," I inferred. Something tightened briefly in Greta's chest. She pressed it flat. "The pay would be considerably more than what the placement agency arranged," he continued. He named a number. It was more than Greta had made in any 3-month period of her life. "If you're willing." She thought of the $700 she owed in rent. She thought of her mother's voice saying, "You act before your brain catches up." She thought of Miriam's hand, warm and small and certain, patting hers in the hallway. "Yes," she said. "I'm willing." He nodded once, as though that settled it. He picked up the newspaper, then he set it down again. "The woman from last night," he said. "Ingrid Voss. She will not be returning to this house." He said it the way he might report that a particular vendor would no longer be used. Simple and complete. "I want you to know that. It's your house," Greta said. "You don't need to." "I'm not explaining myself," he said. "I'm telling you." He picked up the newspaper again. "Mrs. Pelham will go through the specifics with you." "Thank you, Greta." She recognized the end of the meeting. She went to the door. "Mr. Delacorte," she said. He looked up. "She likes the amber lamp. The small one, with the amber shade. It helps her sleep." He held her gaze for a moment. His expression did something she didn't quite catch before it was composed again. "I didn't know that," he said. "Now you do," she said, and left. She saw him differently after that. Not more, not less. Differently. She was with Miriam most of the day, and he was in his study or in meetings or gone entirely for stretches of hours at a time, and their paths crossed the way they always had, briefly in hallways at the edge of rooms, but the quality of those crossings had shifted. The way a familiar piece of music shifts when you finally understand what key it's in. He checked on his mother every morning before he left the house. Greta had not known this before, because she'd been in the household early, but not early enough. Now she was with Miriam from 7, and at 7:15 every morning there was a knock, quiet 2 taps, and he would come in and sit on the edge of the bed or the chair near the window, and speak with his mother for 10 or 20 minutes in a voice that was nothing like the one he used for business. Lower and slower, asking her about the oak tree, about what she'd had for breakfast, about Robert when Miriam brought him up, without trying to correct the story or redirect it or explain. He just listened every morning. Greta tried not to hear. She always heard. In the afternoons when Miriam slept, Greta had time. She used it to learn the household more thoroughly, to prove to Mrs. Pelham that she was worth the rate she was being paid, to run small errands in the neighborhood that the other staff didn't have time for. On the 3rd week, she took Miriam for a walk in the garden when the weather held. Berta had told her it was done sometimes, but nobody had done it recently. And they walked the path around the old oak tree twice, slowly, Miriam holding her arm and narrating the history of a garden she was partly imagining and partly remembering, and Greta listened to all of it. She did not think about Christian Delacorte in any way she intended to examine too closely. She was practical about this, in the way she was practical about most things. She knew the shape of her life and where she stood in it, and what the distance was between where she stood and where he stood. And the distance was not small. She was 26 years old and 2 months behind on a student loan she'd taken out for a nursing program she'd dropped out of when her mother got sick, and she weighed more than she'd been taught to be comfortable with, and she had spent her whole life in the east side of a city where people like Christian Delacorte existed as rumor and shadow. She was not confused about these things. She kept her head down and did her work and liked Miriam, genuinely liked her, the way you like someone who is completely without pretense. And she was, against her better judgment, beginning to feel comfortable in this house. That was the dangerous thing. She'd felt comfortable before in places she should have known were temporary, and she was old enough now to know how that went. It was Miriam who started it, in the end, which shouldn't have surprised Greta as much as it did. It was a Saturday afternoon, 6 weeks into the new arrangement. Miriam was having a clear day, the days Greta had come to recognize as such, where Miriam's eyes had a focused quality, and she knew what year it was, and she called Greta by name without prompting. On clear days, Miriam was sharp in a way that had nothing to do with age, and a little wicked and funny. On clear days, you could see exactly who she had been for the first 70 years of her life. They were in the garden with tea. Miriam was watching the oak tree. Greta was reading, or trying to. "He watches you," Miriam said. Greta looked up. "At dinner sometimes when you bring my tray up and then go back down." Miriam sipped her tea with an expression of absolute innocence. "He watches the door after you leave, Miriam. I have dementia, not blindness." "You also have a tendency," Greta said, "to tell me stories." "I do," Miriam agreed. "That one's true." She set down her cup. "He's not an easy man, I know that. His father wasn't either. There are men who come from a certain kind of life, and they hold everything very tightly because they learned, young, that what you don't hold tightly gets taken." She was looking at the tree. "He held his whole life tightly for a very long time. He is not accustomed to someone simply doing the right thing, for no reason, without being asked." "I had a reason," Greta said. "You were going to fall." "Yes," Miriam said. "That's what I mean." They sat in the garden for another hour, and the afternoon light came through the oak tree in long, slow pieces, and Greta kept her eyes on her book and did not think about what Miriam had said, and thought about it constantly. She ran into him that evening on the back staircase. Not a planned thing. She'd been going down for a glass of water, and he'd been coming up from the direction of the kitchen, which she had not known he ever visited at 11 at night. He was still dressed, but his jacket was gone, and there was a glass of something dark in his hand, and he stopped 1 step below her, and they were briefly at the same height. "Sorry," she said, moving to go past him. "Greta." Her name in his voice again had that quality she was trying not to pay attention to. He looked at her for a moment. "My mother seemed well today, better than I've seen her in some time. She had a good day, the garden helps. She told me." A pause. "She told me several other things as well." Greta held very still. "Your mother tells a lot of stories." "She does." He was watching her with that dark, unhurried attention. "Not all of them stories." The staircase was narrow, and he was 1 step below, and the house was very quiet at this hour, and she was 26 and he was 43, and she knew exactly what the distance was between their respective lives, and she also knew, standing on this staircase, that she had known he watched the door for some time now and had been careful and methodical about not knowing it. "I should," she started. "Have dinner with me," he said. It was the same tone he used for everything. Not a command, not quite a question, something between them that expected an honest answer. She stopped, started again. Mr. Delacorte. Christian, he said. Like that settled the question of what to call him. She looked at him on the dark staircase and thought about all the distances and all the practicalities and the clear, plain voice in the back of her head that had been keeping its own counsel on this matter for 6 weeks. "I'll think about it," she said. Something shifted in his face. Not quite a smile, something quieter and more deliberate than a smile. "That's not a no, she said. "It isn't." She went past him on the stairs, and she did not look back. And she went to the kitchen and drank her glass of water, standing at the counter in the quiet dark. And her heart was doing something loud and unreasonable and completely beyond her control, and she stood there until it slowed. And then she went back upstairs to bed. In the morning, she checked on Miriam at 7, and at 7:15 there were 2 quiet knocks, and he came in and sat in the chair near the window and asked about the oak tree, and Miriam told him about it, and Greta stood at the other side of the room and kept her eyes on the window and did not allow herself to look at him at all. And she was smiling the entire time, and she couldn't help it, and she stopped trying.